The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon, and welcome to everyone joining us today. I particularly want to welcome our witnesses, Ambassador Ronald Lauder, the President of the World Jewish Congress, Mr. Roger Cukierman, President of the Representative Council of Jewish Institutions of France, and Mr. Dan Asmussen, Chairperson of the Danish Jewish Community. In 1982, during my first term in Congress, I traveled with the National Conference on Soviet Jewry to Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, to meet with Jewish refuseniks in their homes and to engage Soviet leaders. Mark Levin invited me to be on that trip and has been a friend and a mentor ever since. For hours on end, Mark and I and a delegation that included former Democrat member of this committee, he was the ranking member, Sam Gajenson, heard stories of Soviet physical and mental abuse, systemic harassment, gulags and psychiatric prisons, and an array of seemingly wanton, brutal acts of anti-Semitism. To apply for an exit visa, a universally recognized human right, which on paper at least the Soviet Union had acceded to, was to invite the cruelty and the wrath of the KGB and other small-minded, morally stunted thugs. To courageously seek freedom rendered you ineligible for employment in Lenin's farcical workers' paradise. The Soviet system, militantly atheistic and morally incoherent, wouldn't let Jews leave, but didn't want Jews to stay either, a bizarre paradox. To a brand new 27-year-old congressman, it was bewildering and deeply troubling. Why do they hate Jews? And I pondered that question over and over again. And why the anti-Semitic obsession? Well, sadly, it has not changed, and it is getting worse. This is the 9th hearing I've chaired on combating anti-Semitism. The first was right after the Republicans took control. We put together a hearing called The Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism. And even though the Soviet Union had matriculated to Russia, we heard how anti-Semitism had become privatized, and the government was doing little or nothing to mitigate its occurrence. And we also heard that it was rising everywhere as well. However, never in modern times has the need to defend Jews everywhere been greater. My next hearings will be on the explosion of anti-Semitic hate on college campuses and Jewish community security, which increasingly has to be addressed and real dollars put in place to lessen that threat as well. For the first time since the Holocaust, the physical security of Jewish communities in Europe had become a top-level concern. Our hearing today will examine the horrifying state of affairs facing Jewish communities in Europe at this time. At a congressional hearing that I had in 2002, Dr. Shimon Samuels of the Wiesenthal Center in Paris testified, and I quote him, "The Holocaust for 30 years after the war acted as a protective Teflon against blatant anti-Semitic expression, especially in Europe. That Teflon," he said, "has eroded, and what was considered distasteful and politically incorrect is becoming simply an opinion. But cocktail chatter," he went on to say, "at fine English dinners can end as Molotov cocktails against synagogues." That's exactly where we are now, 13 years later. What was anti-Semitic cocktail chatter then has now led to 2 people shot and killed at a synagogue at a Jewish cultural center in Copenhagen, and 4 killed in a terrorist attack on a kosher supermarket in Paris. These are only the most recent outrages and a terrifying increase in extreme anti-Semitic violence. Let's not forget the May 2014 murder of 4 people at the Jewish Museum in Brussels and the March 2012 murder of 3 Jewish children and a rabbi at a Jewish school in the French city of Toulouse. Each of these 4 attacks were perpetrated by a killer with links to a jihadist movement. For far too long, far too many government officials, many of them mired in what Natan Sharansky summarized as the application of double standards and the demonization of Israel, have reacted weakly to this danger. Meanwhile, the threat has grown exponentially. Today, at least 3,000, perhaps more than 5,000 EU citizens have left to join ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and other conflict zones. This is the recent estimates of Europol, the EU's joint criminal intelligence body. It would be criminally irresponsible not to take this number as a warning of much worse to come and to make every effort to prepare accordingly. And of course, that also applies to those who have gone to those battlefields from the United States. In 2002, in response to what appeared to be a sudden, frightening spike in anti-Semitism in several countries, including the U.S., I first proposed the idea of conferences on combating anti-Semitism under the auspices of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Convinced we had an escalating crisis on our hands, I teamed with several OSCE partners, including Germany and members of the Bundestag, to push for action and reform. Many of the people in the NGOs present in this room played leading and pivotal roles in that effort. Those efforts directly led to the creation of the OSCE's personal representative on combating anti-Semitism, which has been filled with great distinction by Rabbi Andy Baker since 2009. Rabbi Baker has done outstanding work, dogged and energetic. He has been the driver behind everything the OSCE has accomplished in fighting anti-Semitism in recent years. My efforts with partners to put anti-Semitism on the OSCE agenda also led to important conferences in Vienna, Berlin, in Bucharest, and last fall in Berlin. In each of these participating states have made solemn, tangible commitments to put our words into action. In some countries, progress indeed has been made. Institutions to fight anti-Semitism have been created, and they have done excellent work. They've also done the all-important work of chronicling it. As Sharansky said at one of our hearings, he said, if you don't chronicle the crime, how can you fight it? But it has not been enough to reverse the new anti-Semitism sweeping Europe, and has failed miserably to anticipate and prevent the arrival of jihadist anti-Semitism in Europe. That is why we are here today, to review, recommit, and re-energize efforts to stop the evil of anti-Semitic violence that is threatening the Jewish communities of Europe. And again, this is worldwide, but our focus primarily is on Europe today. We need to learn more about what must be done to ensure community security, how the communities see the threats they face, what they are doing about them, what the European governments are doing about them, and how everyone can and must do more. We can also learn how the U.S. should do more and be more effective in this fight. And this, especially in light of World Jewish Congress President Lauder's all-important question, who will lead off our witnesses, when he says in testimony today, where is the United States? Ambassador Lauder will say, once again, like the 1930s, European Jews live in fear. In my travels to all of these communities, he goes on, I am asked the same question around Europe and the world. Where is the United States? Why isn't the United States leading the world in this crisis? Let me begin the questioning, if I could. At our hearing in February of 2013, Yudi Yasser, who's the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and a very outspoken man against or in the combating of anti-Semitism, made a very, very important insight, provided the committee a very important insight, when he said the link between Islamism and anti-Semitism is rather simple. It is self-evident that supremacists from within a particular faith community will create and exploit hatred towards another faith community in order to collectively rally their own followers against a common enemy. Then he went on to explain how this crowds out a more moderate Muslim view, and he says these theo-fascists use the demonization of minorities as a populist tool to rally populations to their fanaticism. He went on in great depth, and I'll put part of this back into the record because I think it's so insightful, that this is how they push out people who, the Sadats of this world, who reach across the divide and try to, offer a common ground with Jews and with the state of Israel. And I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that, because it seems as if the extremists win when there is not a counterforce equal or greater to that effort. Secondly, Mr. Asmussen, you mentioned Ira Forman. I would note for the record that in 2004, I sponsored the amendment that created that office and the position, and very insightful at the time. Senator Voinovich had a bill that I sponsored on the House side. His bill passed, came over to the House, and I worked very closely with members on the other side of the aisle. We had a bipartisan effort to create an office that doesn't just do one report, but makes it permanent time and time again to do reports to monitor anti-Semitism and to create this position to work within the State Department as well and I would appreciate your thoughts on how well you think that office might be doing. But at the time, 2004, Colin Powell, who was then Secretary of State, wrote a letter against the office, against the amendment. He thought the Human Rights Bureau could handle it all. It was reminiscent of what Bill Clinton did when I authored the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and sitting right in front, and it became law. He did sign it eventually. But the State Department sent over a letter saying, the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, that it will just absorb all of this into the Human Rights Report and just do a little more reporting on it, but don't create a lane where this will be looked at for what it is. Similarly, when we were working with the coalition, and I formed it, of the willing in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, I was shocked at how many members of Parliament said, why don't we just expand it to everything? Now, I do believe we need to combat anti-Christian beliefs and all the others. I've had hearings on it, what's happening, and I know, Mr. Ambassador, you have spoken out very forcibly on that, but there's a specific sense of disproportionality to how Jews are singled out. Look at our own FBI statistics on hate crimes relative to belief of faith. Christians far outnumber all numbers in the country, yet less than 10% of the FBI hate crimes are committed against Christians. Ditto for Islamists or Muslims in this country. Not so for Jews, who make up well over 60% of all the hate crimes, even though they're only 2% of the population. It is so disproportionate, it cries out for a single focus. So, and even as we were doing the conferences, there was always this move by the Dutch and by others to just make it about xenophobia and about other issues, always to exclude and, in my opinion, reduce in its focus the issue of combating anti-Semitism. So your thoughts on that, again, on whether IRA and how well you think that committee is working. And then finally, I would just say, I have other questions, but I want to make sure my colleagues get time to answer those as well. So please, if you could begin.
I believe Congressman Mr. Clausen asked me a question. I understand fully your skepticism towards getting the collective Muslim community in order to confront hate and prejudice. I understand it. Because what we see in Denmark, and I talk to many Jewish leaders here, and it's the same all over. The Muslim community tends to be very fractioned. You will never tend to find a body as we do within the Jewish community. And I believe if we find racism and hate in Jewish community, we will confront it. The problem is it doesn't happen that often. But I see some changes. I mean, sometimes you have to also look at the positive notes, and there are a few positive notes. Muslim organizations coming up with ideas like peace rings about synagogues. There are not many Muslims participating in these initiatives, and I would not like to exaggerate, but there is a change. And so when you ask what is done now, there's a lot of things in Denmark being done by the government. I mean, there's after Paris, there's a huge catalog of anti-terror legislation being rolled out. It seems like the murder, he was known to the system. I mean, he was, many people had reported him to the police intelligence again and again. He was released from jail 3 weeks before he killed. He went to the authorities to get help getting a flat. No one did anything. So there is a lot of things that the community can do. You can do many things to spot radical behavior earlier, but also you can also do a lot, and we're working on that in Denmark right now, in order to spot and help people. But on the long term, nothing will change unless the mentality change. if it's legitimate for religious leaders to teach that hatred towards Jews, nothing will change. And we have cases in Denmark that imams has been doing exactly that, and it takes a lot of time for the system to come down on them. So they keep on doing these things. We are having organizations speaking intensely on hatred toward Jews, but it's very hard to outlaw them according to Danish legislation. We're looking into it, but in my opinion, on the long term, the solution has to come from within.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, we're talking about Europe. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in this country. Starting off, it is taught. Children are born without hate. They are taught hate. It's most prevalent in our universities, campuses. We have an organization called Caravan for Democracy, which is a Jewish National Fund does. We go on campuses all over. The amount of anti-Israel, which morphs into anti-Jewish, has happening all over. It's happening because there is an organized group putting money into these things to put pressure on Israel, but it goes into anti-Jewish also. The media is guilty, very guilty. I watched CNN during the Gaza war. 95% of it showed people in Gaza being killed. There was almost no coverage of the 4,000 rockets going to Israel. We watch it and it has an effect. And anti-Semitism is also learned at the dinner table. When a mother and father are sitting there and they watch television and they watch what happens and they see reporting that is so biased, and they say to each other, look at those Jews, what they're doing to people. Look how they're killing people. The children hear it and they repeat it. And what happened is that there was no understanding in media about what can be done. We watch and we monitor what's happening on the internet. It is disgusting what we see and the amount of things that go on, and yet there was no regulation against it. Anti-Semitism is going to morph into anti-Christian and anti-Muslim at times. We are at the beginning of something that is very, very dangerous, not only for Jews in Europe, but Jews throughout the world, as well as Christians, and for that matter, Muslims. We ask ourselves, why isn't there more Muslim moderates? Because they're scared to death. If I was a Muslim and I was a moderate, I'd be worried for my life, because there is a feeling, it's not just, we'll vote and see who's right. There's a whole radical things, and it's taking over the country. It's taking over what's happening. And in many ways, what's happening in Europe is the canary in the mine. And the fact is that what's happening there will be happening here very shortly unless we react. And I commend the committee for taking this up, but look at it not for Europe, not for Denmark, not for France. Look at it for the world, and look at it what's happening in our college campuses. It's something there. We also see that in mosques, the amount of hatred against Jews, but also against America is there. We have monitored mosques, and we see what's going on. Mosques are a place should be for love, understanding, help. Too often, they're places of radicalism. We hear this, we know this, we've seen it, but the fact is there are no laws against it. There's no laws against what you can say, and that is the danger. There's no law that what you can say on the internet or on media, and we see it. And we're just a small segment here. You have 40 countries here. Each one country can sit here and testify what's happening here. We speak among ourselves, and frankly, we feel powerless. And I think if I asked every person, what's the one place we look towards? We look towards the United States. We look towards the United States for the help and the understanding, because it's the one country that stands up for religious rights in a very strong way. We need the Congress. We need your help. We need people, not only this committee, but a whole looking at what laws. You mentioned about Ira Foreman, what went on. Here's one person that you try to get in. You had people fighting it. There was a feeling also that people don't want to see this. They want to stay away from it. We had a situation in California recently where a girl wanted to join an organization, and because she was Jewish and was part of a Jewish organization, she was denied it. There should have been a huge outcry, and there wasn't. And again, Roger Cukierman is fighting a battle. He's fighting a battle. The French government is there, but there's very little he can do. If you have 6 million Muslims, even if 1% of them, and using math without a computer, it's still 60,000 people who could be radical. What do you do about that? There's no laws about it. Canada has just started to look at different laws that can be done. We must have type of things here in this country. It must be a chance for everybody to turn around and say, this is the model. These are what should be done. And we're allowing it to happen. Sorry.
Yes, I want to say also that anti-Semitism is not the problem of the Jews. It's the problem of the society. And it's not neither a European problem. It's a world problem. And we are in a war with the jihadism. The jihadism is the fanatic Islam. And you were the first victims of that phenomenon on 9/11. I think that 9/11 was the first step of that war. We are in a war, and I wish somebody asked among you, what can you do? First of all, you have to realize that you are in a state of war. And secondly, you have to react at that state of war. One of the things which you can do is to see to it that internet stops being a school to educate jihadism.